The dust kicked up from Samuel Hayes's worn boots as he guided his tired horse down the main street of Cedar Falls. The small frontier town looked the same as it had 6 months ago during his last supply run, though perhaps a little more weathered around the edges. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the wooden buildings, and the familiar sounds of a working town filled the air. Hammers rang against anvils from the blacksmith shop, children laughed somewhere in the distance, and horses snorted and stamped their feet outside the various establishments. Samuel pulled his hat down lower over his eyes, not because of the sun, but because he preferred to avoid the sympathetic looks that still came his way. Even after 2 years, people in Cedar Falls remembered Margaret. They remembered how she used to come to town with him, how she would chat with the other women while he conducted his business, how her laughter could be heard across the street when something particularly amused her. Now those same people would look at him with that careful expression that said they wanted to help, but didn't know how. His ranch lay 30 miles east of town, far enough that he only made the journey when absolutely necessary. Today was one of those days. His supplies had run dangerously low, and winter was approaching faster than he cared to admit. The thought of spending another winter alone in that empty house made his stomach tighten, but he pushed the feeling away. There was work to do. Samuel hitched his horse outside Morrison's general store and took a moment to study his reflection in the dusty window. His beard had grown longer than Margaret would have liked, and his clothes showed the wear of a man who lived alone and cared little for appearances. At 42, he felt much older than his years. The lines around his eyes had deepened, carved there by grief as much as by the prairie sun. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside, and Jacob Morrison looked up from behind the counter with a genuine smile. Jacob had always been a good man, the kind who treated everyone fairly regardless of their circumstances or background. "Samuel Hayes," Jacob said, setting down his pencil. "Good to see you again. How's that ranch holding up?" "Well enough," Samuel replied, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his shirt pocket. "Need to stock up before the cold hits." Jacob nodded and began gathering items as Samuel read from his list. Flour, coffee, beans, salt, sugar, ammunition, lamp oil, and a dozen other necessities that would see him through the harsh months ahead. The two men worked in comfortable silence, their movements efficient and practiced. As Jacob tallied the cost, he cleared his throat. "Samuel, I hope you don't mind me saying, but you look like you could use a good meal. Mary's got a pot roast going at the house, and there's always room for one more at our table." Samuel appreciated the offer more than he could say, but the thought of sitting around a family table, watching Jacob interact with his wife and children, made his chest ache. "Thank you, Jacob, but I should head back before dark." Jacob studied his face for a moment, then nodded without pressing the issue. "Course, but the offer stands any time you're in town." Samuel was loading the last of his supplies into his saddlebags when he heard it. A woman's voice, speaking in what sounded like Chinese, followed by the deeper tones of a man responding in heavily accented English. The conversation was taking place somewhere nearby, but he couldn't see the speakers from where he stood. Curiosity getting the better of him, Samuel walked toward the corner of the building. What he saw there stopped him in his tracks. A young Chinese woman knelt in the dirt beside the general store, her hands clasped together in front of her chest in a gesture of pleading. Her black hair was pulled back severely, and her simple blue dress was clean, but showed signs of wear and repeated mending. Despite the dust on her knees and the desperation in her posture, she carried herself with a dignity that commanded respect. Standing over her was a large man with an unkempt beard and clothes that smelled of whiskey even from a distance. Samuel recognized him as Bart Sullivan, a man known throughout the territory for his meanness and his tendency to take advantage of anyone he perceived as weak. "Please," the woman was saying in English, her accent thick, but her words clear. "I work hard. I cook, I clean, I do whatever you need. But I cannot marry you. I cannot be your wife. Sullivan laughed, and the sound made Samuel's jaw clench. You don't get much choice in the matter, Mei Lin. Your passage was paid for, and you signed the papers. Far as the law's concerned, you belong to me. The woman Mei Lin shook her head firmly. The papers say I worked for you for 2 years to pay the debt. Nothing about marriage. Nothing about being your property. Samuel had heard about arrangements like this. Chinese women would sign contracts to work as domestic servants in exchange for passage to America, but some unscrupulous men would deliberately mislead them about the terms. The women would arrive expecting to work as housekeepers or cooks, only to find themselves trapped in situations they never agreed to. Sullivan's face darkened. You'll do what I tell you to do, or you can starve on the streets. Ain't nobody in this town gonna take in a Chinaman, especially not a woman. Samuel felt his hands clench into fists. Margaret had taught him that a man's character could be measured by how he treated those who couldn't defend themselves. She would be ashamed if he walked away from this situation. Actually, Samuel said, stepping around the corner, that's not entirely true. Both Sullivan and Mei Lin turned to look at him. Sullivan's expression immediately shifted to one of annoyance, while Mei Lin's eyes filled with a hope so fragile it made Samuel's heart ache. This ain't your concern, Hayes, Sullivan said, puffing up his chest. This is between me and my property. She's not property, Samuel said calmly, though his voice carried an edge of steel. And I'm making it my concern. Sullivan took a step towards Samuel, trying to use his size to intimidate. You best mind your own business and head back to that empty ranch of yours. Samuel didn't move. He'd faced down rustlers, wild animals, and men much more dangerous than Bart Sullivan. The man was a bully, and like most bullies, he was fundamentally a coward. Here's what's going to happen, Samuel said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the evening air. Miss Mei Lin is going to make her own choice about her situation. You're going to respect that choice, and if you have a problem with that arrangement, you can discuss it with me. Sullivan looked back and forth between Samuel and the woman. Several townspeople had begun to gather, drawn by the raised voices. Samuel noticed Jacob Morrison standing in his doorway, and Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house had stopped to watch from across the street. This is ridiculous, Sullivan blustered. She signed a legal contract. I paid good money for her passage. Then you can take your concerns to the territorial judge when he comes through next month, Samuel replied. But right now, this lady is free to go wherever she pleases. Mei Lin had remained silent during this exchange, but now she stood and brushed the dust from her dress. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the obvious fear in her eyes. Mr. Sullivan, she said, I will work for you as agreed in the contract. I will cook and clean and help with your business. But I will not share your bed, and I will not marry you. These things were never part of our agreement. Sullivan's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. Being challenged in front of the townspeople was clearly not something he was accustomed to. You can't dictate terms to me, girl. I own you for 2 years, and you'll do what I say. The contract says domestic work, Mei Lin said firmly. I have copy. I read English better than you think. Samuel was impressed by her courage. Many people, regardless of their background, would have been cowed by Sullivan's aggressive behavior. But this young woman stood her ground despite being far from home and having no obvious allies. Even if that's true, Sullivan said, his voice taking on a wheedling tone, where you gonna live? I'm the only one offering you a roof over your head. Before Samuel fully realized what he was doing, he heard himself saying, That's not true either. Everyone turned to look at him, including Mei Lin. Her dark eyes were wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. My ranch has a guest room, Samuel continued, the words coming out despite his mind screaming at him to stop talking. Miss Mei Lin is welcome to stay there while she figures out her situation. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Samuel couldn't believe he'd just offered to take a complete stranger into his home. He'd barely spoken to anyone in months, and now he was volunteering to have a house guest? But there was something about the dignity with which Mei Lin had handled herself, the quiet courage she'd shown in the face of Sullivan's bullying, that reminded him of Margaret's strength. His late wife would have done exactly the same thing if their positions were reversed. Mei Lin looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You would do this for stranger?" she asked. "For Chinese woman you do not know?" "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. "I would." Sullivan looked between them with disgust. "This ain't over," he said finally. "She owes me money, and I intend to collect." "Then you can present your case to the judge like any other business dispute," Samuel replied. "But for now, the lady goes where she chooses to go." Sullivan glared at them both for a moment longer, then spat in the dirt and stalked away toward the saloon. Samuel watched him go, already wondering what kind of trouble this decision might bring down on both of them. When he turned back to Mei Lin, she was looking at him with an expression of gratitude mixed with wariness. "Why you help me?" she asked. "Most people here, they do not like Chinese." Samuel considered the question. The honest answer was that he didn't fully understand his own motivations. Maybe it was because Margaret would have expected it of him. Maybe it was because he recognized something in Mei Lin's situation that reminded him of his own loneliness and displacement. Or maybe it was simply because it was the right thing to do. "My wife used to say that kindness doesn't cost anything," he said finally, "and there's already too much meanness in the world." Mei Lin's expression softened slightly. "Your wife, she is good woman?" "She was," Samuel said, the familiar tightness returning to his chest. "She died 2 years ago." "I am sorry," Mei Lin said, and something in her tone made Samuel look at her more closely. There was a depth of understanding in her eyes that spoke of personal experience with loss. "Thank you," he said. "What about you? Do you have family back in China?" Her face clouded over. "Had family, but that is different story for different time." Samuel nodded, recognizing that some wounds were too fresh to discuss with strangers. "My ranch is about a day's ride from here. If you're serious about coming with me, you'll need some supplies for the journey." Mei Lin looked down at her simple dress and the small cloth bundle that apparently contained all her possessions. "I have no money for supplies." "That's all right," Samuel said, already mentally calculating what she might need. "We can figure out the details later." Jacob Morrison appeared at Samuel's elbow, having walked over from his store. "Samuel, you sure about this? Taking in a stranger, especially with Sullivan making threats?" Samuel appreciated Jacob's concern, but his mind was made up. "I'm sure." Jacob studied Mei Lin with the careful expression of a man trying to gauge someone's character. After a moment, he seemed to reach a conclusion. "Miss, you're going to need some proper traveling clothes and supplies for the journey. Come into the store and we'll get you fixed up." Mei Lin looked between the two men with surprise. "You also help stranger?" Jacob shrugged. "Samuel's a good man. If he says you're all right, that's good enough for me." Inside the store, Jacob's wife, Mary, helped Mei Lin select appropriate clothing for ranch life. A practical wool dress, sturdy boots, a warm coat, and various personal necessities. Samuel watched as Mary treated Mei Lin with the same courtesy she would show any customer, asking her preferences and making sure everything fit properly. As the women worked together, Jacob pulled Samuel aside. "You know Sullivan's not going to let this go. He's got a mean streak, and he doesn't like being shown up in public." "I know," Samuel said, "but I couldn't just walk away." Jacob nodded slowly. "Margaret would be proud of you." The comment hit Samuel harder than he'd expected. He'd been second-guessing his decision ever since the words left his mouth, wondering if he was making a terrible mistake. But Jacob was right. Margaret would have been proud. She would have done the same thing. When Mei Lin emerged from the back room in her new clothes, Samuel was struck by how different she looked. The practical dress and boots made her appear more confident, less like a lost refugee and more like a woman ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. "Thank you," she said to Mary, then turned to Samuel. "How I repay your kindness?" "You don't owe me anything," Samuel said. "But if you want to help around the ranch, I won't turn down the assistance." Mei Lin nodded seriously. "I work hard. I know animals, I know cooking, I know many useful things." As they prepared to leave town, Samuel found himself wondering what exactly he'd gotten himself into. His quiet, solitary life was about to become significantly more complicated. But for the first time in months, he felt something other than the crushing loneliness that had become his constant companion. The journey to his ranch would take them well into the night, and they would need to be careful. Sullivan's threats were not idle, and there were other dangers on the road after dark. But somehow, Samuel felt more alive than he had since Margaret's death. As they rode out of Cedar Falls, Mei Lin sitting carefully on the horse Jacob had loaned her, Samuel couldn't help but think that Margaret would have approved of his decision. She'd always believed in helping those who needed it, regardless of the potential consequences. Behind them, the lights of the town began to fade. Ahead lay 30 miles of prairie, a ranch that had felt too empty for too long, and an uncertain future that suddenly seemed full of possibilities Samuel hadn't dared to imagine. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and Samuel found himself looking forward to reaching home for the first time in months. Whatever challenges lay ahead, at least he wouldn't be facing them alone. The moon hung low and full above the prairie as Samuel and Mei Lin made their way along the worn trail toward his ranch. The night air carried the scent of sagebrush and the distant promise of winter, and their horses' hooves made a steady rhythm against the packed earth. Samuel had traveled this route countless times, but tonight felt different. The presence of another person, the soft sound of her horse breathing beside his, made the familiar journey feel like something entirely new. Mei Lin rode with surprising skill, her posture straight and confident despite the borrowed horse and saddle. She'd been quiet since they left town, but Samuel could feel her watching the landscape around them, taking in the endless expanse of grass and sky that stretched to the horizon in every direction. "You are not afraid to live so far from other people?" she asked suddenly, her voice clear in the still night air. Samuel considered the question. "Used to have my wife for company. After she died, I guess I preferred the quiet." "Until tonight," Mei Lin said, and there was something almost like humor in her voice. Samuel found himself almost smiling. "Until tonight." They rode in companionable silence for several miles, both lost in their own thoughts. Samuel kept glancing at his unexpected companion, still not quite believing he'd invited a complete stranger to live on his ranch. Everything about the situation went against his natural caution and his carefully constructed solitude. "Tell me about your wife," Mei Lin said eventually. "What was she like?" The question caught Samuel off guard. Most people in Cedar Falls avoided mentioning Margaret directly, as if speaking her name might cause him pain, but Mei Lin's tone was gentle, genuinely curious rather than intrusive. "Margaret was—" Samuel paused, trying to find the right words. "She was the kind of person who saw good in everyone. Strong-willed, but in a quiet way. She could convince you to do just about anything, and you'd think it was your own idea." "She sounds wise." "She was. Much wiser than me." Samuel's throat tightened slightly. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said people deserved a chance to show who they really were." Mei Lin was quiet for a moment. "I think I would have liked her, too." The simple statement somehow meant more to Samuel than all the sympathy he'd received from well-meaning neighbors. There was no pity in Mei Lin's voice, no careful distance. just a genuine acknowledgement of his loss. "What brought you to America?" Samuel asked, feeling that he should return her openness. Mei Lin's hands tightened slightly on her reins. "My husband died 3 years ago. Fever took him and our baby son. In China, woman with no husband, no son, has no place. My husband's family, they did not want me. I heard in America, woman can make her own way." Samuel felt a familiar stab of recognition at her words. The pain of losing a spouse was something few people truly understood, unless they'd experienced it themselves. But to lose both husband and child at once— "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it completely. "Long time ago now," Mei Lin replied, though her voice suggested the wounds were still tender. "But it explains why I understand about being alone, why I know what it means when someone chooses kindness over safety." They reached the halfway point of their journey just as clouds began to gather across the moon. Samuel knew these signs well, and his concern must have shown on his face. "Storm coming?" Mei Lin asked, reading his expression with surprising accuracy. "Looks like it. We can push hard and try to beat it home, or we can shelter in those rocks up ahead and wait it out." Mei Lin looked at the dark clouds building on the horizon, then at the distant rocky outcropping Samuel had indicated. "What would your Margaret have said to do?" The question surprised Samuel with its directness. He thought for a moment, trying to imagine his wife's practical voice. "She'd say taking shelter was the smart choice. Getting caught in a prairie storm at night is dangerous business." "Then we shelter." Samuel nodded, impressed by her quick decision-making. He led them toward a cluster of large boulders that would provide protection from wind and rain. They dismounted and quickly set up a basic camp, using Samuel's bedroll and supplies to create a comfortable space between the rocks. As the first drops of rain began to fall, they settled in to wait out the storm. Samuel built a small fire using wood he kept in his saddlebags for emergencies, and soon they had a warm circle of light pushing back the darkness. "You are good at this," Mei Lin observed, watching him work. "Living on land, taking care of things." "Had to learn," Samuel said, adjusting the fire. "Ranch life doesn't give you much choice. In China, I lived in city before I married. Never learned about animals or growing things. My husband, he was merchant. We lived above his shop." Samuel studied her face in the firelight. "What did you do there, before you married?" A small smile crossed Mei Lin's features. "I helped my father with his business. He imported silk and tea from other provinces. I learned to read and write, to keep accounts, to speak with customers. That's more education than most women get, even here. My father was different. He believed daughters could be useful for more than just marriage." Her expression grew sad. "But after he died, my mother needed marriage dowry to survive. So, I married." Samuel was beginning to understand that Mei Lin's story was more complex than he'd first realized. She wasn't just a refugee seeking basic survival. She was an educated woman who'd been forced by circumstances into a situation far beneath her capabilities. The storm broke in earnest then, with lightning illuminating the prairie and brilliant flashes and thunder rolling across the sky like cannon fire. Rain pounded down in sheets, but their shelter held firm. Samuel found himself oddly grateful for the delay. Sitting by the fire, talking with another person, felt more natural than he'd expected. "Tell me about your ranch," Mei Lin said during a lull in the thunder. "What do you raise there?" "Cattle, mostly. Some horses. Margaret kept a garden, but I haven't done much with it since." He trailed off, then continued. "House is bigger than I need now. 4 rooms, plus a root cellar and barn. Sounds like good place for a fresh start." Samuel looked at her across the fire. "Is that what you're looking for? A fresh start?" "What else is there?" Mei Lin replied with a directness that caught him off guard. "Old life is gone. Old family is gone. Can only build new life now." Her words resonated with Samuel in a way he hadn't expected. For 2 years, he'd been living in the past, surrounded by memories and unable to move forward. The idea of building something new seemed both impossible and suddenly surprisingly appealing. The storm passed before dawn, and they were able to continue their journey as the sun rose over the wet prairie. The landscape looked different in the morning light, washed clean and sparkling with dewdrops. Samuel found himself seeing his familiar territory through fresh eyes, noticing details that had become invisible through repetition. When they finally reached the ranch, Samuel felt a complicated mix of emotions. The house looked smaller and more weathered than he remembered, the garden area overgrown with weeds, the whole place carrying an air of neglect that he'd somehow stopped noticing. Mei Lin dismounted and looked around with evident interest. She walked slowly around the yard, examining the barn, the well, the chicken coop that Samuel had largely ignored for months. Her assessment was thorough, but not judgmental. "Good bones," she said finally, returning to where Samuel stood beside the horses. "Place just needs attention." Samuel felt oddly defensive and grateful at the same time. It was better when Margaret was alive. Of course it was. 2 people take better care than 1 person alone. Mei Lin's tone was matter-of-fact rather than critical, but still good place, can be good again. Inside the house, Samuel watched nervously as Mei Lin looked around the main room. He tried to see it through her eyes. The dust on every surface, the empty fireplace, the table where he ate solitary meals, the chair where he spent long evenings staring into the darkness. "Guest room is back there," he said, pointing toward the rear of the house. "It's clean mostly. Margaret always kept it ready for visitors." Mei Lin walked to the doorway and peered in, then nodded approvingly. "Very nice. More space than I had on ship coming to America." Samuel realized he was holding his breath, waiting for her to find fault with his home or his housekeeping. When she instead began unpacking her few belongings with apparent satisfaction, he felt an unexpected relief. "You must be hungry," he said awkwardly. "I can make some coffee and fry up some bacon." "I cook," Mei Lin said immediately. "You did long ride too. Rest while I make breakfast." Before Samuel could protest, she'd taken over his kitchen with an efficiency that was both impressive and slightly unsettling. She moved around the space like she belonged there, finding everything she needed without asking, turning his sparse supplies into what promised to be a much better meal than his usual fare. Samuel sat at his own table feeling like a guest in his own home. It wasn't an unpleasant feeling, exactly, but it was strange after so many months of solitude. The kitchen filled with unfamiliar but appealing scents as Mei Lin worked, humming softly under her breath. "You can cook," he observed as she set a plate in front of him. "One of my useful skills," she replied with what might have been amusement. "My mother made sure I learned everything needed to run household properly." The food was indeed excellent. Far better than anything Samuel had prepared for himself in recent memory. As they ate, Mei Lin asked practical questions about the ranch operation, the seasonal routines, the challenges of managing livestock and property alone. Her questions revealed a sharp intelligence and genuine interest in understanding how everything worked. Samuel found himself explaining aspects of ranch life he'd never had to put into words before, seeing his own work through the eyes of someone encountering it for the first time. After breakfast, Mei Lin insisted on cleaning the kitchen while Samuel tended to the horses. When he returned, he found her standing in the doorway of what had been Margaret's sewing room, looking thoughtful. "This room," she said carefully, "it was special to your wife?" Samuel's throat tightened. She spent a lot of time there. Sewing, mending, reading, her chair's still there, and all her things. Mei Lin nodded slowly. "Some rooms need time before they can be used again. I understand." Her sensitivity to his feelings about Margaret's space surprised Samuel. Many people had suggested he should clean out the room, and put it to practical use. But Mei Lin seemed to understand instinctively that grief had its own timeline. "What will you do about Bart Sullivan?" she asked, changing the subject to something equally challenging but more immediate. Samuel had been trying not to think about that problem. He might cause trouble. Try to claim you owe him money or that you're breaking some kind of legal agreement. "Contract says domestic work for 2 years, Mei Lin said firmly. "I have copy. Nothing about marriage or being property. That may not matter to Sullivan, or to some of the territorial authorities, if he can convince them to see things his way." Mei Lin was quiet for a moment, considering this. "In China, we have saying, 'Crisis is opportunity wearing frightening mask.' Sometimes dangerous situation teaches you who your real friends are." Samuel found himself impressed once again by her philosophical approach to adversity. She seemed to face challenges head-on rather than trying to avoid them or hoping they would disappear. That afternoon, Samuel showed Mei Lin around the ranch property, explaining the boundaries and pointing out areas that needed attention. She listened carefully, asking intelligent questions about water sources, grazing patterns, and seasonal preparations. "You could use help with winter preparations," she observed, looking at the barn roof that needed repairs and the garden area that should be cleared before the first hard freeze. "I've been managing," Samuel said, though he knew the truth was that he'd been letting things slide for months. "Managing and thriving are different things," Mei Lin replied gently. "Place like this, it wants to be cared for properly." That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset, Samuel found himself more relaxed than he'd been in memory. The presence of another person in his space felt natural in a way he hadn't expected. "Thank you," Mei Lin said suddenly. "For what?" "For seeing person instead of problem. For choosing kindness when you could have walked away." Samuel considered her words. "I think maybe you're the one doing me a favor. This place has been too quiet for too long." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear. Samuel realized that for the first time since Margaret's death, he wasn't dreading the approach of night and the long, lonely hours that lay ahead. "Tomorrow," Mei Lin said as they prepared to go inside, "I start earning my place here. You will see I am good worker." Samuel wanted to tell her that she didn't need to earn anything, that her presence was already changing his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. But instead he simply nodded. "Tomorrow," he agreed. As he lay in bed that night, listening to the soft sounds of another person moving around his house, Samuel felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. The future, which had seemed like an endless repetition of empty days, suddenly held possibilities he couldn't have imagined just 24 hours earlier. Outside his window, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of change and the scent of new beginnings. The first month passed more quickly than Samuel could have imagined possible. Mei Lin had thrown herself into ranch work with a determination that both impressed and occasionally worried him. She rose before dawn to tend the chickens, spent her days learning to care for the cattle, and worked until well after dark, repairing years of neglect around the property. Samuel found himself looking forward to their evening conversations on the front porch. When Mei Lin would share stories about her life in China, while he told her about the early days of building the ranch with Margaret. Somehow, talking about his late wife had become easier in Mei Lin's presence. She listened without pity or discomfort, treating Margaret's memory with the same respect she showed everything else. The changes around the ranch were remarkable. The vegetable garden had been cleared and prepared for next spring's planting. The barn roof was patched and weatherproofed. The house itself had been cleaned from top to bottom, though Mei Lin had carefully avoided disturbing Margaret's sewing room without being asked. Samuel was mending fence line on a crisp November morning when he spotted riders approaching from the direction of town. His stomach tightened when he recognized Bart Sullivan leading a group of 3 men. They rode with the aggressive posture of men looking for trouble. "May Lynn!" Samuel called toward the house. "Company coming!" She appeared in the doorway, took one look at the approaching riders, and disappeared back inside. Samuel knew she was getting the rifle she'd seen him keep by the front door. The woman was nobody's fool. Sullivan and his companions reined up about 20 feet from where Samuel stood, close enough to be intimidating but far enough to make conversation require raised voices. Samuel noticed that 2 of Sullivan's companions wore deputy badges, though he didn't recognize either man. "Hayes," Sullivan called out, his voice carrying an edge of satisfaction. "I've come to collect my property." Samuel set down his tools and walked closer, keeping his hands visible but ready. "Don't see any property of yours here, Sullivan." One of the deputies, a thin man with nervous eyes, cleared his throat. "Mr. Sullivan has presented a valid contract to the territorial authorities. The woman owes him 2 years of labor." "Labor, yes," Samuel replied calmly. "But she's been working, just not for him." Sullivan's face darkened. "The contract specifies she works for me, on my property, under my supervision." "Show me where the contract says that," Samuel said. The second deputy, older and more experienced-looking, pulled out a folded paper. "Contract states 2 years of domestic service in exchange for passage to America." "Domestic service," Samuel repeated. "Doesn't say where that service has to be performed." Sullivan spurred his horse closer, trying to use his size and position to intimidate. "You can't just steal my worker, Hayes. I paid good money for her passage." "Nobody's been stolen," Samuel said, standing his ground. "Miss May Lynn is working to honor her contract. She's just doing it somewhere she's safe and treated with respect." The older deputy looked between the 2 men with the expression of someone who'd handled too many similar disputes. "The law says she has to fulfill the terms of her contract. If she's not working for Mr. Sullivan as agreed, she's in violation." Samuel felt anger building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "And what's the law say about misrepresenting the terms of a contract? About lying to someone about what they're agreeing to?" "That's a serious accusation," the deputy said carefully. "It's a serious crime," Samuel replied. "Ask Miss May Lynn what she was told about her obligations. Ask her what Sullivan tried to force her to do that wasn't in any contract." Sullivan shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "She's got ideas above her station. Thinks she can pick and choose her duties." "Her duties according to the contract," the older deputy said, studying the document more carefully, "are cooking, cleaning, and general household maintenance. Nothing here about personal services or marriage obligations." The younger deputy looked confused. "Then what's the problem?" Sullivan's jaw worked furiously. "The problem is she's not where she's supposed to be. The contract says she works for me." "The contract says she provides domestic services," the older deputy corrected. "Doesn't specify location as long as the debt is being paid off through labor." Samuel seized the opening. "Miss May Lynn has been working full-time since she arrived, cooking, cleaning, maintaining the property. If Mr. Sullivan has a legitimate business dispute about the terms of her service, he can present it to the territorial judge when he makes his circuit." The older deputy nodded slowly. "That seems reasonable. Ma'am," he called toward the house. "Would you come out here, please?" May Lynn emerged from the house, and Samuel noticed she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the obvious tension of the situation. She walked to stand beside Samuel, close enough to show solidarity but not close enough to hide behind him. "Ma'am," the deputy continued, "can you read English?" "Yes, I can read," May Lynn replied clearly. "Have you read your contract?" "Many times. I have copy inside house." Sullivan snorted. "Probably a forgery." May Lynn's eyes flashed dangerously. "I do not lie, and I do not cheat. Contract says I work 2 years as domestic servant to pay for passage. Nothing about marriage, nothing about sharing bed, Nothing about being property. The older deputy looked at Sullivan with obvious skepticism. Is that what you were telling her the contract required? A woman alone needs protection, Sullivan said defensively. Marriage would have been for her own good. That wasn't your decision to make, the deputy said firmly. The contract is for labor, not personal services. Sullivan's face was getting redder by the minute. She's supposed to be working for me, not for him. I am working, Mei Lin said firmly. Every day I work. I cook, I clean, I take care of animals, I repair things that need fixing. This is domestic work, as contract says. The younger deputy looked back and forth between the parties. But she's working for Hayes, not for Sullivan. Contract says I provide domestic service, Mei Lin replied patiently. Does not say I must live with man who lies to me and threatens me. Samuel stepped forward slightly. Miss Mei Lin is welcome to stay here as long as she wants. She works hard, earns her keep, and is treated with the respect any worker deserves. The older deputy studied the contract again, then looked at Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, unless you can prove that this woman isn't fulfilling her obligations as written in this contract, there's no violation here. She's providing domestic service, just not to you personally. This is ridiculous, Sullivan exploded. I paid for her passage. And she's working to pay off that debt, Samuel said. What you paid for was 2 years of domestic labor. That's what she's providing. The older deputy folded the contract and handed it back to Sullivan. Far as I can see, everyone's living up to their legal obligations here. Miss, you make sure you work the full 2 years as agreed. Mr. Sullivan, you make sure you don't interfere with this arrangement unless you want to face harassment charges. Sullivan looked like he wanted to argue further, but the deputy's tone made it clear the discussion was over. This ain't finished, he said, glaring at Samuel and Mei Lin. Yes, it is, the older deputy said firmly. Any further disputes get settled by the judge. Now let's head back to town. As the 4 men rode away, Samuel felt tension drain out of his shoulders that he hadn't realized was there. Mei Lin stood beside him, watching until the riders disappeared over a rise. Thank you, she said quietly, for standing with me. Thank you for being brave enough to stand at all, Samuel replied. That took courage. Mei Lin was quiet for a moment. In China, we say that courage is not absence of fear. Courage is doing right thing even when you are afraid. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Samuel found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed. The lonely silence that had haunted his days had been replaced by companionable conversation and shared work. The ranch was thriving again under Mei Lin's attention, and he found himself taking pride in the place once more. Samuel, Mei Lin said suddenly, using his first name for the first time since she'd arrived. Can I ask you something? Of course. Your wife's room, the sewing room. You think she would mind if it was used again? Samuel felt his throat tighten, but not with the sharp pain he'd expected. What did you have in mind? Winter is coming. Room has good light, good space. Could be useful for many things. Samuel considered this. The room had been closed off for 2 years, preserved exactly as Margaret had left it, but maybe that was doing a disservice to her memory. Margaret had never been one for shrines or preservation. She'd believed in using things, in life moving forward. What would you do with it? Maybe workshop for winter projects, mending, sewing, making things useful. Your wife, she had good setup for such work. Samuel was surprised to find that the idea didn't cause him pain. Instead, it felt like a natural progression, a way to honor Margaret's memory by making her space useful again. I think Margaret would like that, he said finally. She always said a room was meant to be lived in, not preserved like a museum. Mei Lin nodded slowly. Good tools should not sit unused, but I go slow, with respect. The next few weeks brought an early winter, with snow falling steadily and temperatures dropping enough to keep the cattle close to the barn. Samuel was grateful for Mei Lin's help with the extra work that cold weather brought. She proved remarkably capable with the animals, despite having no previous experience with ranch life. One evening in December, as they worked together to bring in extra feed for the livestock, Samuel realized that he could no longer imagine the ranch without Mei Lin's presence. The thought of her leaving when her contract was fulfilled filled him with an unexpected sense of loss. "Mei Lin," he said as they finished their chores, "have you thought about what you'll do when your 2 years are up?" She paused in brushing snow off her coat. "Still have 1.5 years left. Long time to think about future. But you have thought about it." Mei Lin looked out across the snow-covered prairie. "In China. I thought America would be a place where woman could make her own choices. So far, this is true." "What kind of choices?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Where to live, who to trust, how to use talents I have, whether to build new life or keep looking for something different." Samuel felt his heart beating faster. "What if I told you there was a place here for you? After your contract is finished, I mean. As a partner in the ranch, not just a worker." Mei Lin turned to look at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Partners share ownership, share decisions, share profits and losses." "Yes. Partners also share dangers and responsibilities. Share worry when times are hard." "Yes. And what about other kinds of sharing? You are still married man in your heart, Samuel. Your wife is still very much alive in this house. In your thoughts." Samuel felt the truth of her words. Margaret was still a presence in his life, probably always would be. But over the past months, he'd come to realize that honoring her memory didn't mean stopping his own life. "Margaret will always be part of who I am," he said carefully. "But she's gone, and I'm still here. I think she'd want me to keep living, to find happiness again if I could." Mei Lin studied his face in the lamplight. "And you think you could find happiness? With Chinese woman who speaks with accent and knows nothing about being rancher's wife?" "I think I already have found it," Samuel said, surprised by his own certainty. "These past months have been the happiest I've been since Margaret died. Not because I've forgotten her, but because I've remembered what it means to share life with someone." Mei Lin was quiet for so long that Samuel began to wonder if he'd said too much, pushed too hard. Then she reached out and took his hand. "I think about this too," she said softly. "About staying, about building something here. But marriage is not just about happiness. It's about commitment through hard times, about building future together." "I know. And about children, family. I am 31 years old, not too old, but not young either." Samuel felt his breath catch. The possibility of children, of a growing family, was something he'd given up hope for years ago. "Would you want that? Children, I mean? With right man, in right place, yes. Very much." They stood there in the falling snow, hands joined, both understanding that they were talking about far more than ranch partnerships or business arrangements. "Mei Lin," Samuel said finally, "would you consider staying here, not as a worker fulfilling a contract, but as my wife? As a partner in every sense?" She squeezed his hand gently. "Ask me again in spring," she said. "When contract is closer to finished, when we have shared winter together, when we both know better who we are to each other." Samuel nodded, understanding the wisdom in her words. What they were building together was too important to rush. "But Samuel," she continued, "I think answer will be yes. This place feels like home in way no place has since I was child in my father's house." As they walked back to the warmth of the house together, Samuel felt a contentment he'd thought was lost forever. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and uncertainties, but also full of possibilities. Behind them, their footprints in the snow marked the path they'd walk together. Ahead, the house glowed with welcoming light, no longer the empty shell it had been, but a home once again. Spring would come, and with it decisions about the future. But for now, it was enough to know that neither of them would face the long winter alone. They had found in each other something precious and rare, a second chance at building a life filled with love, respect, and the quiet satisfaction of work shared between equals. The lonely widower who had ridden into town for provisions had found something far more valuable than supplies. He had found a partner for the journey ahead, and a reason to believe that the best chapters of his life might still be unwritten.